You got some stuff for kids. And
That's good.
this little Bible right here normally would be about $47, something like that. I got it for $20.
Oh, that's good.
And the one I carry, I bought that a few years ago when I was at university, and it cost me $70 over here across town.
And what is it?
They had it for $45.
What's the place again?
Half price books.
That price, what's that? I keep saying
HBB.com. Yeah, it's a good place to buy some different things. So I guess I'm live now, ready to go. All right. Welcome. This evening we are in the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 15, and I'm going to begin with verse 21 tonight. Actually, verse 20 and a half says they led him out to crucify him. And that's where we're going to go with this and looking at what Mark has to say and why he has to say it. Again, I keep finding things in Mark's gospel never thought about, never considered before. And there is no way I can get it all in tonight to do justice to the text that's there. So we will split this up tonight and next Wednesday night, and probably the week after we'll finish the Gospel of Mark, and we'll see where that goes. But I want you to read with me a little bit. We'll let's see. We'll start in verse 21, and we'll read the first few verses and go back. Okay. When I turn the page, you got to wait for the verse. There you go. They forced a man coming in from the country who was passing by to carry Jesus' cross. He was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Then they crucified him. You know all the trouble we go through and all the studying we do, and that's all Mark says. They crucified him. 3 words. But we don't have all the background Mark did and a lot of those first century disciples did, so we'll do a little bit digger deeping other than just 3 words. They crucified him and divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each would get. Now it was 9 in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge written against him was, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 criminals with him, one on his right and one on his left. Crucifying condemned criminals in the Roman world was a very public affair, deliberately so. A man by the name of Colin Wells wrote a book about the Roman Empire, and he said, the Romans had a highly developed and theatrical sense of the public ceremony. You know, if you stop and think about what people do to be openly theatrical about certain events and things, and to do that with crucifixion, what a warped mind it takes to do that. The triumph was one aspect of it, and the soldiers had already given Jesus a mock triumph. Crucifixion is the next facet of it. Very horrible means of execution. And basically it had 2 purposes. Anybody have an idea what those purposes might have been?
To show the horror and to try to dissuade anyone else from doing
Okay, that kind of puts it there in perspective a little bit. It punished the criminal by making their pain be prolonged as long as possible. Very excruciating. In fact, that's where we get our word excruciating from, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Victims could linger on their crosses for days, and they slowly died from asphyxiation due to muscle fatigue. I think that's one of the reasons why Pilate was so amazed to hear that Jesus had died so quickly. You know, kind of like, We weren't ready for him to die. We wanted him to linger a little bit longer and hurt. But God was working on things and not Pilate, and that's good. But it also was a warning and a deterrent to people. They would parade the victim through the streets like they did with Jesus, and they would have a placard around their necks announcing what the crime was. And then they were hanged on a cross, and they strategically placed those crosses alongside of well-traveled roads. So everybody coming in and out, traveling those roads, they would see the crucified victims. And, the torment of the victim would strike fear into the hearts of the people that were passing by. One fellow said during the first revolt against Rome, those caught by the Romans tried to sneak away from the besieged city of Jerusalem to forage for food. And they were crucified next to the walls of the city. So people trying to sneak in and out of the city, oh my goodness. Josephus wrote about the Roman general Titus, and he said, he hoped that the spectacle might perhaps induce the Jews to surrender, for fear the continued resistance might involve them in a similar fate. Watch this. The soldiers, out of rage and hatred, amused themselves by nailing their prisoners in different postures, and so great was their number that space could not be found for the crosses, nor crosses for the bodies. That's how many people they crucified and how bad it got. When you look at what's taking place here, this is the ultimate battleground and the greatest example in human history between the battle of good and evil, where Satan did his best to defeat God and lost. So it's an absolutely incredible thing. Mark's account of the crucifixion is very gloomy. It's as gloomy as the darkness he's going to describe here in a few minutes, a few verses down. The darkness that covered the whole land, nothing like the spiritual darkness that covers the world. When Jesus goes to his death, it's in utter loneliness. He's betrayed. He's deserted. He's denied by his followers. The ones who had been called to follow him and said, oh, we'll follow you anywhere, even to the point of death. Well, he's dying. They're nowhere to be found. He faced his death rejected by his own people, his fellow Jews. They had followed him for all the miracles and all the loaves. They always wanted something else from him. But now, they're clamoring for his crucifixion, his execution. They're happy to see this. This is great, as far as they're concerned. But most importantly, he died with the silence of his heavenly Father around him. He had submitted to his Father to drink the cup that God willed him to drink. And yet, nothing from the Father. He dies alone, solo. It's the darkest moment of Mark's gospel. And yet it's told so simply. And yet the darkness, when you think about it, it wasn't total. Because there was a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. There's a resurrection. And that to me is the most incredible thing. And that's why I tell people, if you need words to live by, the tomb is still empty. Amen. There's no darkness. As long as Jesus is alive, there is no darkness. This event is the climax of human blindness and iniquity being spilled out in human rage against God's Son. The one who came for the purpose of loving humanity and helping them out is brutally murdered. He came to deliver them from death. They delivered him over to death. It's amazing to stop and think that Jesus never used his power for himself. He used his power to help others, especially his own people. Even in his seemingly powerless death, he's wanting to help people, and they just won't see it. But here's interesting too. All the traditional symbols, when you think about death, they're reversed here. Oh, he's weak. Now, weakness is a sign of power. You know, God told Paul that, in my weakness, you know, you're made strong. Or in your weakness, I'm made strong, he would tell Paul. And so you look at that, weakness is a sign of power. Death is really a means to life. And that's why for Christians, we don't die, we just change dresses. You know, that's the way to look at it. And being forsaken by God ultimately means reconciliation with God. When it seems like God is so far away, doesn't know and doesn't care, he really does. Sometimes he'll use those things to help reconcile you back to him. But in their ignorance, all these people, they don't realize this death. As much as they want it to be the end of it, it's not the end of it. They don't realize that in what they're doing, executing Jesus, they're actually executing the will of God. Jesus willingly submitted to his death as an obedient son to his Father. You know, and it's just incredible when you stop and think about all the paradoxes, ironies, and all those other things that are wrapped up in that. It's not the end of him, but it's going to be the end of their total order. Everything they think about as Jews. And they couldn't and wouldn't fathom how such a powerless death, how does that disclose the power of God? But it's only true disciples who can see that. You can look at the cross, the crucifixions, and look how powerful God really is. And they're looking at it saying, the man died a brutal death. Yeah, but you don't know what's going on here in all of this. The three biggest issues in the crucifixion, the issues of theology, are dealt with here. And that's the cry of Jesus on the cross, splitting the temple veil from top to bottom, the centurion's confession. Those three things are incredibly loaded with theology, understanding God and how God works. And only those first disciples and Mark's readers then and Mark's readers now can grasp anything about that and appreciate what's going on there. So in verses 21 through 24, there's a death march to Golgotha. They brought him to the place called Golgotha. The victim's cross was normally started with a cross beam of about 30 pounds that he had to carry all the way to the site of the crucifixion. And he was tied to that cross beam, and as he's doing that, not only did they beat him earlier, they're whipping on him while he's carrying his crossbeam. And as he's whipped, the whips they used would rip the flesh off of your body. And he is basically has had his clothes taken off of him. They're torn to rags. And over time he's overcome with such cruelty that a lot of times the victims who were being crucified would utter very painful cries. And they would have, as I understand it, some rather indecent movements and comments that went along with, you know, they're going to get their last in. You're getting it in on me, but I'm going to get a last comment or two towards you. But not Jesus. He makes no sounds. You know, I don't know if he uttered any groans. I would, wouldn't blame him if he did. That seems natural human suffering. But we don't know of anything that he said, any sounds that he made. He's not made to carry his own cross, probably from being too weak. He's too slow, too fatigued from the lashing he's already taken and what he's taking now. It's been a long day and a long night of enduring stress, physically, mentally, and spiritually. And one fellow wrote this, and he said, one of the profound paradoxes of Christianity is to be found in the fact that the one who is not able to carry his own cross is the one who enables us to carry our own cross. Isn't that something? So they call on this man, Simon Cyrene, to carry the burden of Jesus. What do you know about Simon? Anything? You think of anything you know about Simon of Cyrene, other than the fact he's from Cyrene? Bible says, Mark says, he was passing by. He's passing by. It's interesting because the phrase Mark uses is the same phrase that is used when Jesus was passing by when he called some of his first disciples. Okay? Just interesting how some of that wording goes. He's coming from the country or the field somewhere, and he's coming into the city. And now he's got to reverse his direction, and the guards give him this cross beam so that they can take Jesus outside the city to execute him. There's two things we know about Simon. He's from Cyrene. Anybody know where Cyrene's at? North Africa. In North Africa. And secondly, he's the father of Rufus and Alexander, his two sons. And one of the interesting things is they don't even figure into the plot. You know, why tell me who his sons are? Why do you think Mark does that? Anybody have an idea? A guess?
Later on in the scriptures, are they mentioned? Is Alexander mentioned? No.
No. But Paul will mention in Romans 16:13 a man named Rufus.
Oh, it's not Alexander. Rufus.
And Polycarp will mention him in his letter to the Philippians. Tradition says he later became a Christian. Simon did. And Mark mentions his name because evidently the first readers of his gospel, they knew who that was, because remember, the readers are in Rome. Mark writes his gospel to those people in Rome. They knew something about these first Christians over in Jerusalem before all that takes place. So Mark knows something about them, and tradition says that they were all Christians. And we could blame them for doing that, you know, after what they'd seen.
Right.
And wanted to go along with that. One of the interesting things about him is Simon's name, Rufus, Alexander, those are all Hebrew names, they're all Latin names, and they're all Greek names. And what's interesting about that is that's just kind of one of those little underlying comments about the universality of the gospel. All cultures, doesn't matter where you're from, the gospel reaches across. The procession ends at Golgotha. And Mark interprets that for his readers, the place of the skull. Now, whether it was the outcropping of the rock there that was shaped like a skull, and that's why they did it, or maybe because that was the place where they had all the executions, that's where that was located, we don't know. And it really doesn't matter. Mark doesn't go into a lot of detail and describe the crucifixion of Jesus, you know, how he was fastened to the cross, the type of cross that was used, or how excruciating all the pain was. But our word excruciating comes from a Latin word that means out of the cross. Excruciatus, I think is how it's pronounced, or something like that. Everyone in the ancient world probably knew what crucifixion was like. And so to sketch all the horrors of it really didn't do any good. What Mark is interested in doing with the details he gives have a theological significance. They have a biblical significance, if you will. So that's what we look at. And it said they gave him, they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh. And the they probably refers to the same they who had let him out. They're offering this, which has a narcotic property. They want to relieve the pain, not because they're compassionate, but because they want to mock him and scourge him, and they don't want him falling apart on him before they get in more blows on him. They want to be able to do him in a little bit more. But he refused that. Somebody brought out something, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I'll go along with that. And he said, Jesus had made a vow of abstinence at the Last Supper, not to drink of the fruit of the vine until he would drink it anew in the kingdom of God. You're not going to drink the wine that they offer. He's destined to drink the cup of the Father, not the cup of humanity they want to offer. So, there are so many little things that Mark brings up, and you wonder, maybe, I guess, it could be. And usually I don't get too carried away with thinking about that stuff. But in this particular section is one of the times when I thought, I can go along with that now more than I normally could. Yes, sir?
Yeah, well, it could be just that he didn't want a painkiller. Once he smelled it, he knew what it was.
Oh, I think the main reason is he wants to remain fully conscious to the bitter end.
Right.
He's not going to cut short his suffering in any way at all. He's not going to go to sleep. One fellow brought this out. He's not going to go to sleep on the cross the way his disciples did in the garden. Not bad. Not bad. Okay? Verses 25 through 33. You get the derision that comes from the crowd. And we've already read verse 25 and 26 to 27, so we'll jump down. 29 says, those who passed by were yelling insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! The one who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself by coming down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests with the scribes were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, so that we may see and believe." Even those who were crucified with him taunted him. And again, the silent Messiah, all the political overtones he had resisted in Galilee, and that probably disappointed a lot of people. And ironically, that's what they're crucifying him for, being a political Messiah. And the inscription announces for everybody in all the languages, he's King of the Jews. They came out and arrested him as a criminal, and now they crucify him between two criminals. But he has nothing to say to those who are killing him. He's silent. The only words he'll have are for his disciples. You can read when you put the Gospels together the 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross, but Mark doesn't give us all those. What Mark does record is for all the world to hear, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. When you stop and think about the two thieves who were crucified on either side of him, you got to remember back earlier in the Gospel, James and John said, "We want to be with you when you come in your glory on your right and on your left. We want to sit with you." Jesus said, "You really don't know what you're asking for. You have no idea." That dubious honor was reserved for others. And how ironic, on his right and his left, when he comes in glory and they're criminals. And only one of them is going to come out of that. Jesus had spent his life in the company of sinners, so it's kind of fitting that he dies between two sinners. Then the Bible says they were gambling for his clothing. Wow. That's going to be crazy on watching what all they're doing with that. Back in verse 24, they crucified him, they divided his clothes, casting lots for them to decide what each one would get. Years ago, at a church I was preaching at, I think it was in Kansas, there was a fellow who passed away. And he and I were about the same size, and I guess he had a bunch of nice clothing. And so I was invited to come over, see, he had some nice suits and things. Go ahead and, that was kind of a weird thing,
Sure.
That was kind of a weird thing, but hey, it's free and it's cool. So I went along with all that, and that worked out okay.
There was no bartering.
There was no barter. We didn't even cast lots or anything. They just said, "You want it?" I said, "If it fits, it's mine." We kind of went for. I drew a line at the shoes, so I didn't want it worse anyway. So we go on from there. But they're gambling for his clothing here, and that was customary for them to do. The executioners would take all the personal belongings, divide them up, and they would, who wants this? They would cast lots. It would kind of, I'm not sure what all went with that, but that's just kind of a weird thing. What's interesting to me is the only reason I think Mark mentions it is because it has to do with Psalm 22 and verse 18. They cast lots for my clothing. Again, Mark's only interested in theology. He doesn't give us a lot of history. But one of the interesting things that we're going to notice as we go through here is typically Mark hasn't been all that concerned about time frames and things like that. He's going to be very concerned about the time frame here at that crucifixion.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Go on.
I guess you were asking, is that the only reference?
Yeah, is that the only reference you know of to the casting lots for the clothing?
No, I believe it's in some of the other Gospels. So it's, I didn't double check that, but I think that's
But
true.
as far as back in the Old Testament, in their scriptures,
In the Psalm?
And back in those days, they would do that. That was a custom. You know, that, and again, last week, I was bringing out about these soldiers. I think the worst place in the world you can want to be stationed as a Roman soldier is in Jerusalem. You hate the Jews. They're nothing but a pain in your side. Everything about them. So if somebody's going to get crucified, we're going to enjoy this. You know, we're going to get everything out of it we can, even his clothing, you know, if we can do that.
I think he was saying, is there any other reference to Jesus? Jesus' clothing being, being...
The cast lots for him. Yes, I think that is mentioned in some of the other Gospels. I didn't double check that because I did like Mark, you know, it's not that big of a deal.
In the book of Psalms, and not even the...
Oh yeah, Psalm 22 and verse 18.
Scriptures.
Psalm 22 and verse 18 is where it's mentioned.
Right.
And I think that's why Mark mentions it here.
Right, I think the question was that the only reference in the Old
Oh, as far as I know it is.
Testament? Okay.
As far as I know it is, so.
Was that the question?
Thank you for explaining that to an old man.
That's right. Yeah, but when he's on the road, you know,
Yeah, you can't. If you roll me off to the side, I bump into walls. You know, you gotta be careful with me there as we're going. So. Here's what I want to bring out too. One of the things is the garments of Jesus. Look back earlier in Mark's gospel where they've been mentioned. You know, back in chapter 5 and in chapter 6, they were used to heal people just when they touched him. Remember the lady with the issue of blood? All she wanted to do was touch the hem of his garment. So the clothing was very special. And, you know, Mark is showing us some of these things as you, on the one hand, it's used to heal, and on the other hand, you know, they just want to give them away. They don't count anything for him anymore. At the transfiguration, his garments became so white, you know, nobody on earth is going to be able to clean them and get them that white. They were an emblem of God's future glory for his son. But now, they're an emblem of, anybody need any stuff you want to gamble for? That's all they are. The soldiers had beaten him. They had bloodied his garments. They took him off of him. At one point, he gave him a purple robe to wear. Back in chapter 15, 16 through 20. Called him just a humiliated king. And now they're taking and they give him back those clothing to wear to the cross. And then they take him away from him and they gamble for him. Watch how Mark tolls the hours of the crucifixion. It says it was the 9th hour when they crucified him. Or the 3rd hour, I'm sorry. It was the 3rd hour, it was 9 a.m. Then at high noon, the 6th hour, darkness covers the whole land. And then in the 9th hour, the Jewish hour of prayer, Jesus cries out with a loud voice and dies. I think it's been suggested that what Mark wants to do is for us to look closer and see there's a divine plan at work here. They're not just killing this man. God is at work. In verses 28 through 33, you watch the insults they heap at him and the contempt. They're enjoying the agony. And I find that just so strange and perverse to watch how they're doing that. Someone who's being crucified would become the butt of their jokes and contempt and abuse they would heap on him. You know, and I don't know why it is that some people just really enjoy watching others hurt and suffer and die. I can't imagine what that's like for some folks. You've got people from different walks of life here who are heaping insults on him. From the two criminals who are on either side of him, to the priests and the scribes who, come to gloat over their triumph. Interesting word there in verse 29. Ha! Or your version may say, aha! And the NIV says, so. It's a derisive cry when you look through some of the Psalms. Some of these things, if you take a concordance and run them through the Old Testament particularly, you find some of them there. And it was an exclamation of, just a cry to say, who are you? What do you think you are? And then it says they were wagging their head, and that's a deliberate thing that they did. It was a gesture of contempt. And again, you can run that through the Old Testament and concordance and see that. Here's Jesus hanging helplessly on the cross. He looks wholly defeated, and his enemies are doing everything they can to make it look like we've won, you've lost. Game over in all of that. But the scene here, when you look at it, there's a lot of irony. They're spurting and spitting all of their abuse and heaping them on Jesus. But what they're saying out loud, they really don't know they're saying things are the truth. Here you are the king. You have no idea how true that is. Mark says they were hurling insults. Even the passers-by were doing that. The word that's used here sometimes is translated as deride or, yelling insults. The word that's used there actually is translated blasphemy. That's the word it comes from. They're blaspheming him. And what did they accuse him of? Blaspheming the temple and the law and everything else. Mark wants to show us, who's blaspheming who, really, when all is said and done. And one of the things that blows me away on this is when you look at it, you have the high priests and the scribes, the teachers of the law, the spiritual leaders, and they're bad-mouthing Jesus. Rather than having learned truth from the scriptures, they're going to stand on the way they've interpreted them so they can get rid of this menace to their society, the way they view him. So the reader gets to decide who's the real blasphemer here. And they're enjoying this agony. But what they're saying and what they're doing, it's beyond anything they can even imagine or see spiritually. God is accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. You're the one who said you're going to destroy the temple, and in 3 days rebuild it. That's not what he said. But his death doesn't destroy the temple with hands. He does rebuild a new one that's not made with hands. But what they're killing him for is going to come back on their head, and their temple made with hands is going to be destroyed by God ultimately allowing the Romans to do that. It's just such a very interesting and deep thing to consider. When Jesus dies, he abolishes any need at all for any further benefit from a temple not made with hands. And what blows my mind is how can you read these passages the way premillennial thinking people do and still come out with the idea that when Jesus returns, they're going to rebuild the temple made with hands, and he's going to rule there, and the Jews are going to get a second chance and all of that. It just... And then I stop and remember, how can you be so blind? Well, it's because Satan blinds the minds of those who want to believe what they want to believe. So they're taunting the victim, these chief priests, these teachers of the law. They're joining in all the other people, and they're doing this. They're scoffing. Hey, he saved others, but he can't save himself. The verb saved there, that's a verb that was used earlier in Jesus' healings when he saved people, a woman with the issue of blood, the man demon-possessed. And he did save others. In Acts 10, verse 38, Peter will preach at the house of Cornelius and say, Jesus was the one who went about doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil. But they refused, the Jews refused to see that Jesus is the one God had anointed with Holy Spirit and with power so that he could save others and that God was with him. Come on down. You saved others, but you can't save yourself. Man, talk about truth being spoken from dumb mouths. He saved others, but he can't save himself. That's exactly right. He can't and he won't save himself. He's not going to do that. Go back and read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 31 again, and notice that.
Which chapter?
1 Corinthians 1,
Oh, 1.
27 through 31, the foolishness of man, and that sort of thing. When you look at all the spiritual scorning that's going on here, all the insults, all the jeering, and they're underscoring Mark's points. He's not just pointing out, these are the bad guys. He's pointing out, saying, you know, what they're saying is true. They just don't have sense enough to realize it. If he saved others, you know, and how did he save them from a storm in the middle of the Sea of Galilee? A man loaded with demons? You know, over and over you see that. Don't get too focused on the physical pain and suffering here at the cross. Look at ultimately what God is working out in all this. Jesus said in Mark 8:35, the one who wants to save his life will lose it, ultimately, when it's a matter of God's cause. And they don't understand how you're supposed to look at life and death and how you're supposed to see these things in the right perspective. In Mark 10:45, he said he came to give his life a ransom for many. They cannot see, and so they demand a miracle. Come down from the cross. So we want to see this power so that we can see it and we can believe it. How many times have you heard people say that? I had a gunnery sergeant one time that told me, I said, if I can't see it and touch it, I'm not going to believe it. And that's the way he went his way. Never heard no more from him. But they want a miraculous display of power, a miraculous escape from the cross. Then they're saying, we'll be finally convinced. All they're doing really is taunting his helplessness. They really won't believe. They don't want to believe. They just want to taunt him. It reveals something about how shriveled their theology really is. They put the divine power based on human self-serving terms. If it serves my interest, I'll believe it. We got a lot of preachers on TV who are coming across that way. It's all self-serving. It's according to their standards and what they want to do. Jesus, someone said, taught his disciples to take up the cross, not come down from one. Sometimes we want to give up our cross, you know, and have life a little bit easier. Jesus said, take up your cross and carry it. Take up your cross and carry it. Had he come down from the cross miraculously, all that would have shown is, man, he's Superman. Not the Messiah, not the Son of God. They wouldn't have seen that. People who want tangible proof of the divine presence, they're not going to see anything spiritual. They're just not. And so Mark says, darkness covered the land. Darkness covered the land. For the next 3 hours, from the 6th to the 9th hour. From noon until 3 p.m. Yes, sir?
I was just going to say, it's just like Jesus told well, it wasn't a parable, but he told about this man who who died and went to the other side, and he talked about Abraham and how at that particular point this man wanted to warn his family, warn his
rich man
The
Lazarus.
rich man Lazarus.
Yeah,
One of his
15.
people.
Luke 16.
And Jesus' response was, they wouldn't believe that either.
By the way, I was listening to the brother preaching sermon, the one that,
Will you?
yeah, I didn't want to say his name.
Okay.
And he was preaching on that text, he blew it. But that's why I didn't want to mention his name. He blew that. Did good otherwise, but not on that one. So anyway, darkness covers the land. Have you ever thought about what darkness represents in the Bible? Any ideas?
Lack of sight.
Lack of sight? Huh?
Sadness.
Sadness.
Maybe sadness.
Sadness? Okay. Anything else?
Death.
Death?
Absence of life.
Absence of life. That's a pretty good way of saying death. It's associated with mourning. You know, it implied, when you go back and look at like Jeremiah 4, there's one apocryphal writing that even talks about the idea that the death that brings even the sun to lamentation and crying, you know. So mourning. It's also associated with judgment. You know, when you go through the concordance in the Old Testament, Amos 8, 9 and 10, Amos said, "In that day declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun to go down at noon, darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your religious feasts into mourning. I will make all of you wear sackcloth and shave your heads. I will make that time like mourning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day." In Mark 13, verse 24, Jesus said darkness would announce the great day of the Lord. So the idea of judgment in there. And the darkness setting on here may indicate also the beginning of a new day. With the death of Jesus and the darkness, with the resurrection, it's a new day. It's going to be a whole new day. The Bible also says God will clothe himself with darkness. And that reminds us that darkness does not mean God's absence. God works even in the darkness. That's a good one to write down and to remember. The Bible says in the Old Testament, he chose to dwell in thick darkness. When you read Exodus 20 and 21, Moses approached God in thick darkness because that's where God was, in the thick darkness. In 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18, God descends for battle in darkness. And when you think the darkness is dark and there's no one, God's even in the darkness doing what he needs to do. All the images of darkness are a backdrop for understanding Jesus' crucifixion and the darkness that follows with that. The Pharisees had, back in chapter 8, the Pharisees had demanded a sign. And it's interesting to go back, and I can't remember if I brought it out or not, that when you go back and read that in its literal rendering, Jesus said, "If a sign be given this generation," and he doesn't complete the sentence. He left it incomplete. Kind of like, oh, may God strike me dead if God, gives a sign to this generation. But the spiritual leaders are wanting a sign from heaven. It's not like they're really going to pay attention to it. And that's why Jesus cuts it off. If a sign be given to this generation, ain't going to happen. They don't deserve it. They don't need it. They don't want it. They won't take advantage of it. That's why it's an incomplete sentence, literally, when you look at it in the original language. Look at verses 34 through 37. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me? And some of those standing there heard this. They said, see, he's calling for Elijah. Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, fixed it on a stick, offering him a drink, and said, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Jesus' cry from the cross is heaven's cry. And Mark emphasizes he cried out with a great voice. One of the reasons that's interesting, well, there are a couple of them. One of them is that's just kind of unusual for a crucified victim to be able to have strength to do. But there was another thing I found I thought, that's really very interesting. He cried out. To cry out is used by Mark one other time in his gospel. Back in the opening chapter, in chapter 1 and verse 3, he talks about John the Baptizer coming onto the scene, and he applies the prophecy of Isaiah. One calling out in the desert, one crying out is the literal phrase. So at the beginning there's a crying out, and at the end, he cries out at the beginning, make straight the paths of the Lord. Those paths have now been made straight when Jesus cries out. It's done. Messiah has come. He is coming. In verse 34, those are the last words that Jesus speaks in this gospel before his death, as far as Mark is concerned. And those words continue to perplex Christians and just readers of it. There's a lot of explanations, a lot of divided interpretations about the whole thing. There's two things that really stand out. Well, one of the things that stands out is, do you weigh what he said against Psalm 22, all the words in the psalm, or just the words that Mark quoted from? I don't know, and I'm not going to worry about that. The important thing to get from it for me is this. However you interpret the words of Jesus crying out, his death establishes the sovereignty of God. He sent his son to give his life a ransom for many, and Jesus cries out. I like in John's gospel, John says, it is finished. It's finished. He didn't leave anything incomplete. He accomplished everything he set out to do. And that was done at the cross. And so the scriptures are fulfilled when you look at what's said here. When Jesus is arrested, he said then, back in chapter 14, in order that the scriptures may be fulfilled, and it's another one of those incomplete sentences, Robert. In order that the scriptures may be fulfilled, everything else is going to follow. And it does. So we are to overlook the scandal of the cross and to see God at work in his will with the death of Jesus. The scriptures were fulfilled. That was Peter says in Acts chapter 2, it was God's predetermined plan.
Right.
He determined before the foundation of the world, this is what's going to happen and this is why it's going to happen. I want it to happen this way in order to accomplish what I have in mind. Scriptures are fulfilled. Jesus' end is not a failure in any sense of the word, but you know what? Only disciples see that. Everybody else says, that's a shame. But then they go on and look at the resurrection and say, well, how do you believe that? That's just a fairy tale. Well, why did you even believe up to that point anyway? Well, because every great religious leader has to die. We'll talk about some of that more when we get into the resurrection part. Yes, sir.
Sanhedrin, they believed it.
Yeah.
That's why they put the guard at the temple.
But you know what's interesting about that? They believe that,
They
but
believe,
not
they
in
believe what he
immediate
said.
application.
They believe what he said, so that's why they said, we don't want anybody to take the body, anybody to steal the body.
You know how I look at that they believe that? It's
Right.
kind of like us tonight. We believe Jesus is coming back, but not tonight.
Yeah,
Not in the next minute. He's not gonna do that. We believe that, but we really don't want to see it right now.
Maybe not in.
That type.
Maybe not in my lifetime.
Yeah,
You know?
I hope he comes back
Let me
now.
live
I'm ready.
through- Yeah, let me live just a few more years before you.
And usually people who object the most are the ones who aren't ready. They need to be.
Right.
But that's another story. That's another story to get into that. But again, you know, you've got the premillennial thinking on all this. They see the death of Jesus as a failure. He failed. So what are we going to do? Let's set up plan B and we'll establish the church. And we'll have in the meantime, Jesus is going to come back again and he's going to give the Jews another chance. And this time they're going to convert, you know, and they'll have the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem in that city. And the best I could find in my study is a Greek word for that. It's called baloney. It's called baloney. You know, to see the scriptures that way is to totally rethink God's plan for him. Why don't you just look at what he's saying and why he's saying it that way? God had a plan before the foundation of the world, all the way through the creation of the world, the entire Old Testament story, into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That ushered in establishing the church. That's the fulfillment of God's plan through Jesus as the Messiah. And sets in place God's plan to save people through the blood of Christ and identify them as God's people until he returns and we're ushered into eternity. Why can't we see that? It's really not that difficult at all. And I think it's because they're hearing and not listening. Then and today. Same type of thing. Those scoffers back then, they either misunderstood Jesus' final prayer or they deliberately distorted his words as a final jest. He's calling for Elijah to rescue him from the cross. There's a couple of things there. One is Elijah, if you will, John the Baptizer, had already come and they missed him. They didn't recognize him for what he should have been. And now they're offering Jesus a sponge with this sharp wine, give him a burst of energy, maybe kind of mockingly, this will hold him off until Elijah comes here to rescue him. But Elijah was delivered up into heaven with a fiery chariot in 2 Kings 2. But the Elijah you should have recognized, you killed. He's already come. So if they're mocking him, Elijah's not going to come back to rescue him. We killed him. He's already gone. So these scoffers who want to see something really can't see anything. And so Jesus gives up his cry of death. And Mark says with a great voice. When you stop and think about it, in a way, it kind of gives you chills. You know, to say he breathed his last, that's a euphemism for death. The cry is unusual because somebody who is that beaten down, exhausted, fatigued, and, you know, to be able to cry out like that, that has to be a divine intervention to be able to pull that off. But to think about him crying out with a loud voice, you know, if nothing got your attention, that probably would have, or should have, could have. We're going to stop here and we're going to save the carrying of the veil into topic next week. Finish that up, then we'll get into the resurrection part 2 and deal with that. But we've got to deal with the burial and so forth, and a couple other things in there. Anybody have a thought or two you want to add as we wind it up? I usually don't do that.
You know, I was noticing that there's not a verse 28, and then I looked down at the note. But I understand what it's saying, but it's, why did they not, you know?
Oh, I just noticed that too on this one.
I already noticed.
What do they have in there? 28, so the scripture was fulfilled. Oh, there are several places in Mark's gospel, well, 2 or 3 places, where you have that. And basically it's because they'll tell you the earlier, some of the best manuscripts don't include that. I don't have a problem with it because in harmony with everything that was there. And Jesus had already said that earlier in the gospel, so the scripture would be fulfilled. So, you know, there's nothing that's overlooked there. Anything else? Then Raymond, I turn it over to you.
So we are going to have a funeral service here this Saturday. It just kind of popped up. One of our members knows a family who lost their 17-year-old son. And so we're going to step in as best we can and conduct the service here. Pam has circulated a sign up for men or women who can help preparing the funeral meal. And we'll be here Saturday. You'll see an email go out to the church. We'll be here Saturday around 10, and we're just going to clean up a little bit outside. So since we're going to have our event next Friday, we want to make sure we pull the weeds and all that stuff, pick up the trash. So we're only going to be here a couple hours, but if you can help on Saturday around 10, like I said, we're just going to be here a couple hours, just sprucing up the place. So we can use some help with that. If you feel that you can help with the food, if it's not already all taken care of, I'm not sure. Because ladies class, I think, did very good at trying to take care of all those things. Contact Pam Cook. She's in the directory. Pam Cook. And then Erica Rogers and CJ, they're the new couple that have placed membership, and they've got the two little ones. Aria's not feeling too well, so pray for Aria. And we're hoping and praying that it doesn't kind of go to the rest of the family. It's just some kind of stomach bug that she has. And so pray for her. And then also Erica and Sarah, which is the lady who's in here, and also Anthony, she's Anthony's daughter-in-law. So they kind of come together to help me pull off the Easter event. And so Erica has put together a sign-up sheet. You know, we're going to need folks to help set up, tear down, arrange the food bags, stuff like that, hide the eggs, organize the kids, and stuff, things of that nature. And then some desserts, some simple things like cookies, cupcakes, stuff like that. So she put together a sign-up sheet. We'll have it out on Sunday, but if you want to take a look at it tonight, if you're able to sign up or anything, that would be great too. So it's over here on the box as you go out. Take a look at that. Jolene is, from what I can see from Roy's text, is doing better and better. So that's a great praise. We've got other folks, as I mention all the time, just continue your prayers, be mindful of who they are, stay connected with one another.
What time is the funeral on? Did you say the funeral's gonna be on Saturday?
It's gonna be in the afternoon. The family's gonna get back to me. We were discussing it. They want it to be in the afternoon sometime. And so.
So we'll be out of the way then.
Yeah, so we'll be gone by then. I'm thinking the earliest we'll have is 2. That'll be the earliest. So like I said, we'll be here for a couple hours. We'll be gone at 12. And Anthony will prepare a list of things that we need to accomplish and whatnot. We got to put a new sail with a play set. We've got to fix some things. We've got to fix some of the sprinkler systems. We've got to weed and things of that nature. And then also some of the kids are going to get together and hand out flyers in this neighborhood for the Easter event. So adults, you know, if you can't really get down and weed and stuff like that, I totally get it. If you're able to just walk and put a flyer on the door, that's helpful too.
You know what might help out on handing out those flyers?
What's that?
We used to do this when we went to Russia and places like that. We would go to the parks.
Okay, yeah.
We would go to the parks, and because families like to take their kids out to the park, they'd be there, and we'd give it to hand it out there.
Yeah.
And maybe, especially as big as this park is right over here,
Yep.
there'll be a lot of folks out there Saturday.
Good idea. So maybe we get some folks here. I'll have flyers made, and they'll be, you know, a half sheet with the front and back, and maybe we get a couple folks over there too and hand out flyers. And then also, I've still got to get in touch with the senior center. Their events in the morning time on Friday, so it doesn't conflict with our event. But if anyone wants to go out there and join me, or we can set up little groups, and we'll have a banner for the church, we'll have information of the church, and we'll have a canopy that we can set up. If anyone would like to volunteer for that too, just kind of sit there and be friendly and talk to
One of the suggestions on handing them out at parks like that is, it's better going in pairs, just going by yourself like that.
No,
Just
I
looking
think
weird.
Dave's absolutely right, I think we should do everything in pairs.
Yeah,
Same thing if you're walking the neighborhood, we never let people go out by themselves, it's always by twos. So, hey, you'll see an email come across probably tomorrow with all this information. So if you can help, you got a heads up, and then again, the sign-up sheet for our Friday event next week is right here.
one of the other things I like about the parks is you get people from, you're not just going down like the local streets right here, they're living all over the community area
It's
there.
a great idea, I think we should do more than just that park, so, great idea. Saturday, we in that park, but, take extra flyers.
Well, I know over in our neighborhood, we've got 2 little parks there, and there's always people,
Yeah.
especially when the weather starts warming up.
Mine too, so that's a good idea, I'm gonna do that myself in my park. So, yeah, lots of stuff we can do as we move into summer and the warmer weather, we're gonna get busier with things that we want to accomplish and get done. I talked to Wayne, he's got to connect with Robert, I talked to Robert, he's got to connect with Wayne, and we're gonna nail down the time for our Veronica campaign this summer, and for the class that Robert will go over, the class that Wayne will go over in preparation for that.
One of the things I'm gonna do with that is I'll take Jason with me over to the park down there.
Yeah.
Take some of our kids with you like that. We start them early to be a servant,
There you go.
to reach out to people.
It's a great idea, great idea. Well, when you might do that, let's find out live, and we'll join you.
Just let me know when you have the flyers ready.
I'm gonna have them ready for Saturday.
Okay, yeah, we'll probably go Saturday a
I'm
little
ready
bit
for
then.
Saturday. So, yeah, there's gonna be a lot of things coming on the horizon that we have coming up. Once we start, now that we hit April, and then May's gonna come up with a prayer breakfast, and, we're working with the police department to have a family fun day here at the building. So we're gonna have a lot of things opportunities to be involved in, opportunities to. That's it. Yes, sir.
Heard from, Anita Harmon today, and, I was just asking how they were and everything, they're both doing well. She said, I asked how Phil is doing, and Phil, she said he's going down steadily, but, they're both overall doing well.
Good. Good. Jason, I don't know, any of you remember Jason Burnett and Tammy? They have a new grandchild. So their son Caleb's actually got married, he's in Albuquerque. So he's someone we're working on to get back into the church. So that name you can recall, just keep him in prayers. And, keep praying for each other. We can all use it.
Keep praying for my friend.
Is he still a little bit on the upswing?
Yeah.
Good. Good. Very good.
Is that, what about Zedonic?
Hmm?
Zedonic? Is that who you? Zedonic? Is that who you speak?
No.
How is he?
Oh, he's doing better. He was having a bad reaction to some medication. I think we've got him straightened out. I'm glad you said that.
Because you were supposed to get me his phone number or something.
Yeah,
I could get in
it's been,
contact with him.
I've slept a little since then, but not much.
Yeah. Yeah, we went to
Few
school
nights.
together, so.
A few nights.
Maybe. It's iffy at times.
Well, separated by days, and you know what that is.
It's iffy, isn't it, Jennifer? Sleep's kind of iffy for us.
Exactly. I know what you mean.
Sometimes it's there, sort of, in its own way.
When it wants to be.
Anything else, Raymond?
That is all. That's all I have for right now.
You want to dismiss us in prayer, please?
Last thing, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for another opportunity we had to study a portion of your word. Lord, please help us understand what the word meant at the time that it was written.